Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Thank you so much for joining me. This is the podcast, The Endurance of Labor Laws. I'm your lovely host, Lesley Sullivan. Today is episode 155, and this is part 2 of critical race theory. So let's go ahead and get started on this puppy here. So previously, we had just did a little bit of an intro in terms of critical race theory. And it's one of those things that critical race theory is very much, I think it's a topic that very much pokes at people's buttons, because I think different people have different viewpoints and perspectives about critical race theory. But what I do want to mention just up front is that we should not be critical of any race. I think having a theory that's called critical race theory is not appropriate whatsoever. And I think it is very much unfortunate that it has gotten to the point now in the United States that we have something like critical race theory being taught in our schools to our children. And, when we say to our children, we're talking about to little ones and also to those that are under the age of 18. I've said this before in times past, children do not understand what a theory is. That's just, they haven't grown up into an adult just yet. That's why theories like this, they can be taught all day and all day long, but in universities and, scholarly articles and things like that. But in terms of what this is, with critical race theory, I don't think this is appropriate for children. Just like I don't think transgenderism is appropriate for children. Kind of like what we talked about previously, where Pizza Hut got in trouble for trying to pass along a very transgender drag queen reading material for children in their Book It program. If someone wants to be a drag queen and have that kind of lifestyle as an adult, I don't care. I think it's disturbing. It's not my business. I don't want to know about it. But whenever they're trying to push that agenda onto little children, I think that is very disturbing. And I think it is messing with kids. And what I find interesting is that the liberal left and the progressives, they very much are targeting a child's childhood. It's like children can't be children anymore. So they're pushing all these adult ideologies and these adult themes onto little kids. But, children, they don't understand a lot. And the reason why is because they're children. Like they need to be taught the basics first. They need to be taught a basic education, like have a really good foundation, like, English, I would say English, math, and those things, to be taught how to read and write, Anything beyond that, within that age group, I think is inappropriate. Like, I think it's inappropriate for there to be a sex ed class in schools. I think that's completely inappropriate. So it's not really surprising that we have things like critical race theory now being taught in schools, even though it should not. So this article goes on to say that CRT began in the United States in the post-civil rights era, as the 1960s landmark civil rights laws were being eroded and schools were being resegregated. Here's the thing, that's not true. The civil rights laws were not being eroded, they were being enforced. Because you have to remember that, I guess a good example of this would be that book I told you guys about, Rebellion at 20,000 Feet. What's interesting is that the civil rights movement was very important, and so they had an office that was created within the federal government. It is an agency about civil rights, and that whenever someone's civil rights are violated, then you can file not necessarily a grievance, but you can report someone, and then that federal agency that looks into those things, they are the ones that handle that. Well, there had to be a beginning. Well, that beginning was in the 1960s, and so it grew over time. Initially, the agency that handled civil rights and things of that nature, it initially was just in regard to African Americans being discriminated against. But as you will see, if you read the book, Rebellion at 20,000 Feet, there was tremendous discrimination against women. So it was really sad that these flight stewardesses and these airline attendants, especially if they were women, they were not being treated with equality. So then they reported it. And so they reported to, I think it's the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, if I remember correctly. I will double check that. But it's one of those things that, that office was brand new. And so initially when these women, which were in charge of their labor unions, when they filed grievances against the airline industries and those companies, the people that looked into this initially were shocked. They were just like, well, why are you coming to the civil rights kind of federal agency department? This is for blacks that have been discriminated against. But then once they read the reports and what these women were going through in terms of working for these airlines, they just said, whoa, we need to look into this. So the fact that critical race theory is saying that the civil rights laws were being eroded, that's not true. And schools were not being resegregated. If anything, it's just the opposite. I think it was the state of Alabama, if I'm not mistaken, where the governor was not allowing black university students to go to school. And so, or was it high schoolers? Sorry, I have a mental image of these kids going to school. They're either high schoolers or they were freshmen or whatever in college. I can't remember the age range. My apologies. It's been a while since I've read that article. But anyway, that governor, he was supposed to allow the schools to be integrated. So basically it didn't matter what your race is or was, you could go to school. Well, this governor, he basically had his police force with the state block these African American students from going to school. Well, word got to Washington, D.C., and the President of the United States at that time said, you either allow these students to go to class or we are sending the National Guard. Well, the governor of Alabama said, well, I don't care. We're not changing. Well, the President of the United States issued basically a warrant or writ, whichever word you want to use, for the National Guard to go down to Alabama and make it so that black students could go to this particular school. So, and it got pressed in the news, that's for sure. And so it's one of those things that, the civil rights laws were not being eroded and schools were not being resegregated. America was trying to integrate our schools. Here's the thing. If civil rights laws were being eroded and if schools were being resegregated, then we wouldn't have the laws that we have today, and civil rights would have completely failed back in the 1960s, but it did not. See, here's the thing. Whenever you implement something new, it takes time for it to take effect. It takes time to see it come to full fruition because you still might have some not so good people like that governor from Alabama that did not want his schools to have black kids, at least where there were white kids. But see, here's the thing. That was not the opinion of the majority of the United States. And it certainly was not the opinion of the federal government or these federal agencies. Hence, the President of the United States sent the National Guard down there, and the National Guard escorted these students to and from school. So it's one of those things that mindsets and social norms, I guess you could say, and just bad behavior, it takes time to change that when that's all people have ever known. But even so, there were many people that were for schools being integrated. They were very much for it. So these one little bad examples do not reflect the entire scope of the viewpoint of the United States during that time, nor does it represent the mindset of what is going on today with like the woke culture, whatever that stupid word means. I mean, it amazes me what words make it into the English dictionary these days. But anyway, needless to say, critical race theory is really flawed because it's not even acknowledging the good work that came out of civil rights and civil rights laws. Because if they truly were being eroded, then we wouldn't have them today. Because the 1960s was a long time ago, right? So when something gets eroded, typically that means it gets broken down and then it eventually gets disintegrated. It means that it's no longer around. But they were not eroded. There were many lawsuits that took place. So if you have lawsuits taking place in regards to civil rights and civil rights laws, then that means your laws are not being eroded. That means they're being enforced. So just be aware of that. Goes on to say, with racial inequalities persisting, even after civil rights legislation was enacted, CRT scholars in the 1970s and the 1980s began reworking and expanding critical legal studies. Now, I was not aware of what that is. So critical legal studies is a school of critical theory that developed in the United States during the 1970s. Also during the feminist movement, the bra burning movement, and things like that. Critical legal studies adherents claim that laws are devised to maintain the status quo of society and thereby codify its bias against marginalized groups. You know, I'm kind of surprised that something like critical legal studies, which sounds really important, right? It sounds legit. I'm surprised they would be that stupid to think that biases trump the legality of the law and the laws of the land. So obviously this is not really about legal studies. It's about who you think is offended and who you think has been wronged, not that you know who has been wronged. See, this is a perfect example of where it makes it sound like something really cares, like critical legal studies, but it's not even looking at things from a legal point of view. See, that's the issue there. It has to be legal if what they're talking about here in regards to their theories and their studies and things like that, but they're taking things that they claim are part of our laws and our legislations, and they're making it seem like there's all this bad stuff going on. It's like, well, look, no country is perfect. But here's the thing, these things that they're talking about are not relevant and not true. So needless to say, it says that CRT scholars in the 1970s and 1980s began reworking and expanding critical legal studies, also known as CLS, theories on class, economic structure, and the law, to examine the role of U.S. law in perpetuating racism. So here's the thing. I would think that something with a title like critical legal studies would be looking at things that are actually factual. The role of U.S. law is not in perpetuating racism, because we have laws on the books that prevent or do what it can to stop racism, especially at a state or federal level. But here's the thing. You can't stop somebody from disliking somebody else because of the color of their skin. It's like what I was saying in times past. Racism is an individual decision. It's a decision on whether a person likes someone else based on their skin their skin color as opposed to who they actually are as a person. That is an individual character flaw. That is not a societal flaw. That is not a flaw of our country, because it is perpetrated by individuals. So if it's perpetrated by individuals, then it is not coming from the U.S. law. So it's not coming from the laws of the land. Because if anything, the laws of the land have been speaking out and against racism for a long time. One of the first laws that spoke out against racism was the abolishment of slavery, and that goes back to 1865. Now, did that stop racism? No. But it was a step in the right direction. So you have to look at this from, okay, what is our foundation, and are we moving in the right direction? Because it's one of those things like, you know, have you ever met somebody that just couldn't stand you, and you find out later they really didn't like you, and you're going, well, what in the world? Like, I don't even know that person. Like, I didn't do anything to offend them, at least not that I'm aware of. Like, what's the issue? It's kind of surprising, right? Well, it's kind of the same thing with racism. It doesn't make sense. But here's the thing. It's on that individual. That's a character flaw on the individual. And also, that's their loss to not get to know somebody. Because, look, if someone is going to practice a prejudice, that's their stupidity, not everybody else's. That's their loss of a friendship or a relationship. But it doesn't mean that racism is just rampant and horrible and it's just like doing awful things to our country. I mean, mind you, yes, racism is horrible. I'm not saying it's not, but I'm saying that in terms of this example, it's making it seem like racism is something that you can control, via human behavior, and you cannot, because racism is determined by the person's behavior. Good luck controlling other people. So good luck with that. It also says CRT, a framework of analysis grounded in critical theory, originated in the mid-1970s, so we're getting more definitive here, in the writings of several American legal scholars. Now this is interesting. So now we have actually found some people that have supposedly written about this. And these are supposedly the founders of critical race theory, which I kind of disagree with this. It says including Derek Bell, Now, I looked at all these different people, and Derek Bell is the only one that looks like he's old enough to be in this time frame of when critical race theory actually would have been started. These other people I'm going to mention, they're not old enough to be around at the time when this guy wrote this stuff. So it says Derek Albert Bell Jr. was an American lawyer, professor, and civil rights activist. Bell worked for first the U.S. Justice Department, then the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, which those people are corrupt, where he supervised over 300 school desegregation cases in Mississippi. So his work is very important, but here's the thing, the NAACP, it may have started for really good reasons, I have no doubt of that, but they've gotten off track. The NAACP is known for being very, very liberal, very progressive, and does not honor or respect the law. Well, you know, it's kind of hard to fight racism if you're not even respecting the law. So, kind of difficult there. The next person that is considered a legal scholar on critical race theory is Alan Freeman, and then there's Kimberly or Kimberley. She's got a little accent thing over the last E in her name, Crenshaw. Let's see, Kimberly Williams Crenshaw is an American civil rights advocate and a leading scholar of critical race theory. I don't see how she can be a leading scholar because she's not old enough to be in that time frame. So that's really bizarre to me. It says she is a professor at the UCLA School of Law, very liberal school. They're very much for LGBTQ rights. So I'm guessing she's okay with the age of consent being lowered for little kids, so that homosexuals can have sex with minors. So I'm assuming she's okay with that. Let's see here. She's professor at the UCLA School of Law and Columbia Law School, also I'm guessing a liberal school, where she specializes in race and gender issues. So here's the thing. She specializes in race and gender issues. So what I've noticed is that critical race theory is very much connected to transgenderism, the homosexual community, and things like that. It's like, well, you know, if you actually value the human race, then you would not be okay with lowering the age of consent. Because that is an issue. Because we already have problems with child pornography and sex trafficking. It's really disturbing, the stuff that is out there. It's very shocking. So it's one of those things that, you know, you can't be for one kind of immoral or unethical issue or situation. You can't be like, oh, well, this is okay, and then not expect all these other things to piggyback on it. Like, if you stand up for what's right, you have to stand up for what's right on all fronts. You can't just cherry pick. Oh, I'm going to be moral in this issue, but I'm not going to be moral in this other issue. Although people, like these scholars here, they don't think that what they're doing is any way, shape, or form unethical or immoral. So, I mean, these are the elitists, basically. These are the people that want to tell us what to do with our lives and tell us how to raise our children. Okay? Very disturbing. The next one is Richard Delgado. He is an American legal scholar considered to be one of the founders, oh, wow, pat himself on the back, of critical race theory, along with Derek Bell. Delgado is currently he's distinguished, so he's the elitist, a distinguished professor of law at Seattle University School of Law. So, again, a stuck-up, snobby school, very liberal. This is funny. Previously, he was the chair of law at the University of Alabama, which used to be a very racist state. So, way back in the day, what are the odds of this, right? So the next person that's considered the go-to for critical race theory is Cheryl Harris. And it says she is a critical race theorist and professor of civil rights and civil liberties, guess where? At the UCLA School of Law. So, what do you know? A liberal school hiring liberal progressive professors. Who would have thought? The next one is Charles R. Lawrence III. I don't have any information on him, excuse me. The next one is Mari Matsuda. And let's see here. She is an American lawyer, activist, and law professor at the William S. Richardson School of Law at the University of Hawaii. Wow. Hawaii is liberal. It is Democrat. I don't know if it's necessarily progressive, but Hawaii tends to live in Delusionville in terms of what the cost of real estate should cost and the cost of goods, because they're an island. And they do not always have the best opinion of white people, but yet, you know what's interesting is that it's mostly white people that visit their island and help their island stay afloat in terms of their economy, because without tourism, they wouldn't have anything. They would be starving to death. So good luck with that. And here's another thing. It says here she was the first tenured female Asian American law professor in the United States. Let's see, at University of California and then UCLA and something else. You know what I find interesting is that what does it matter what sex or race someone is when you're hiring somebody? Like, if you're not supposed to be looking at race or gender, why mention that? See, that shows you how one-sided Democrats and liberals are. And this happens all the time in Hawaii. All the time. So just be aware that just because Hawaii is beautiful and Magnum P.I., the original Magnum P.I. with Tom Selleck was filmed there, that doesn't mean that the state knows how to balance its budget. It's predominantly Democrat. And without the tourism and hospitality industry, that island would have tanked years ago. So without all these white people, they wouldn't have anything. So just be aware of that. The next one is Patricia J. Williams. It says here, Patricia, oh, by the way, that previous chick, Mari, she doesn't look old enough to be a part of the critical race theory being founded or started in the 1970s. So, little funky there. The next one is Patricia J. Williams. She does look old enough to be a part of critical race theory from the 1970s. It says here, she is an American legal scholar and a proponent of critical race theory, a school of legal thought that emphasizes race as a fundamental determinant of the American legal system. Oh, it's all gypped. We're all screwed. Yeah, that's what she thinks. So it's like, you know what? If you're actually an American legal scholar, then why don't you actually study the law of the United States? Like, look at our Constitution. Look at everything. Here's what I say to people that, think that critical race theory is great. I'm just like, look, if you don't like the United States, then why don't you leave? But here's the thing. No other country on the face of this earth has the same rights as the United States. Like, we have the most freedoms. And what's interesting is that critical race theory wants to limit freedoms, but only on one demographic, and that demographic is on white people. So you can't do that. That's not equality. That's not what civil rights was about. Civil rights was about creating equality, meaning it doesn't matter what race you are. But unfortunately, with critical race theory, they want to bring it back to, it does matter what race you are, except now we're going to suppress whites. Sorry, not happening. That's not cool, people. That's not right, and it's not legal. It's not legal at a state or federal level, especially in criminal cases, I would say in your workplace. Let's say, for example, okay, so if we're going along the lines of critical race theory, okay, so the previous chick, Mari, she's Asian, right? Okay, so let's say, for example, she owns a company. And she doesn't. She wouldn't be good at it because she's a professor. Most professors cannot function in the private sector, so that's why they teach at colleges. So they typically do not work well with others, and they're so bizarre in their theories that they can't really function in normal private sector jobs. So let's say, for example, this Mari Matsuda owns a company. And let's say, for example, she thinks that, white people are bad, so no whites are allowed to be hired, and preference is going to be given to Asians, then blacks. Do you really think that would stand up in court? Like, do you really think she would not be called out on that and be taken to federal court for practicing discrimination, especially on job applications? See, that's the thing. Critical race theory, if they were to have their way, they would have discrimination against anyone that is white. Anyone. And in any situation, any circumstance, so just think about if you're white and critical race theory gets its way, you would not have access to employment and you would not be allowed to go to the schools that you want to go to. Why? Because they believe it's okay to practice reverse discrimination because their theory and their indoctrination is founded in hatred. It's not about raising the bar. It's about taking that bar and using it against a certain group of people is what it's called. Let me put it this way. Whenever someone offends you, the worst thing you can do is lower your standards. It's better to raise your standards so that way the person that is offending you, hurting you, or harming you knows, hey, I'm not going to sink down to your level. So if you want to be a grown-up, you need to come up to the level up here, which is of dignity, kindness, and respect. None of those people believe in dignity, kindness, and respect, because if they truly believe in what they are practicing and what they've written about, which is critical race theory, they're not good people. They're not promoting equality. They are promoting inequality, which is stupid. It's like, if it's a violation of federal law and or state law and employment law, then maybe you shouldn't be practicing it. Goes on to say, CRT draws from the work of thinkers. Oh, so these are also elitist, okay? The thinkers, Antonio Gramsci. Now this guy, it says here, was an Italian Marxist philosopher. Ooh, gee, that's kind of, I was going to say hypocritical, but kind of an oxymoron, because under Marxism, you're not allowed to be a philosopher because you're not allowed to think for yourself. In philosophy, I would say in the realm of philosophy, it's kind of a requirement that people be allowed to be themselves and think for themselves. But under Marxism, they don't want you to think for yourself. So it's kind of an oxymoron. So it says he was an Italian Marxist philosopher, journalist. Marxists are against freedom of speech, which includes journalists. He was a linguist, a writer. Marxists are against writers. They very much lock him up, especially in the Soviet Union. And a politician. Wow, so very communist. He wrote on philosophy, political theory, sociology, history, and linguistics. Guess what? Everything he wrote on is not really allowed in communist countries. That's very interesting. See, that's the hypocrisy of these so-called thinkers, these elitists. They think their opinions are the only opinions that matter and nobody else's, which is why this is so stupid. It says he was a founding member and a one-time leader, oh, get this, of the Communist Party of Italy. There's a reason why Italy was for Mussolini and why Italy was punished severely for having a leader like Mussolini and being on the wrong side of the war, so to speak. The nation of Italy was not some sweet, innocent, pasta-making country. It just wasn't. They had a problem with anarchists, they had a problem with Marxists, and sure enough, they became communist. Beautiful, sweet little Italy, where they make a bunch of wines, was communist. The reason why was because there were a lot of communists and anarchists that immigrated there from the Soviet Union, especially after the Tsar was murdered. The Tsar of Russia. It was anarchists that murdered him and his family. So just be aware of that Marxists are not people that you should look to for advice. And you shouldn't, for sure be thinking that, oh, this is a great thinker. Well, gee, what did people like this think about the Communist Party? They killed a lot of people. Is that a great thinker? I would think not. So then the next thinker that CRT draws from is Sojourner Truth. Now that was not her real name. Let me click on her. It says Sojourner Truth, born Isabella, that's a pretty name, Isabella Baumfree, was an American abolitionist and women's rights activist, although she was more on the African American side of women's rights, I would say. Truth was born into slavery in New York, but escaped with her infant daughter to freedom in 1826. After going to court to recover her son in 1828, she became the first black woman to win such a case against a white man. So here's the thing. She actually went to court and won. And this was before the Civil War. So if ever there are, blacks out there saying that, oh, blacks can't go to court, we can't get justice, this woman did. She did just that. So it's one of those things that you kind of have to take things with a grain of salt here. Let's see, the next one, is Frederick Douglass. I've heard of him. He was an American social reformer, abolitionist, orator, writer, and statesman. After escaping from slavery in Maryland, he became a national leader of the abolitionist movement in Massachusetts and New York, becoming famous for his speeches. So it's one of those things that, there were people that were for him in his day. Otherwise, he would have never been successful. You know what I mean? So not all whites were racist and not all whites agreed with slavery. Hence, we have the Civil War. And even before the Civil War, the North was predominantly the one that they ended their slavery before the South, and then that's what the Civil War was about, that the South refused to end their slavery there. The next one they talk about is W.E.B., it's called Dubois, so he has a French last name, but it's William Edward, I think it's Burghardt Dubois. He was an American sociologist, socialist, there we go. Not good. Historian and Pan-Africanist, civil rights activist. Let's see what it says here. He was born in Massachusetts. Dubois grew up in a relatively tolerant and integrated community, and after completing graduate work at the University of Berlin, oh no. Yeah. There's a lot of socialists in Berlin, especially back then, because that's obviously in Germany, so I'm not surprised he became a socialist. And then he did graduate work at Harvard University, where he was the first African American to earn a doctorate. God bless him. He became a professor of history, sociology, and economics at Atlanta University. Awesome. Here's the thing. It says Dubois was one of the founders of the National Association of the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP. It says here, the NAACP is a civil rights organization in the United States formed in 1909 as an interracial endeavor to advance justice for African Americans by a group including this guy and someone else. But see, here's the thing. The NAACP has been pretty horrible to white people for a while, and that's very unfortunate because the NAACP actually was trying to help blacks. But if you target whites, then you're not actually helping the people that you say you're supposed to be helping. And needless to say, the NAACP has become very socialist, very progressive, very liberal, and it has not always been very nice to people. So I think it was founded for a good reason. I just think it's gotten completely off track. Some other thinkers, quote-unquote thinkers, that they draw their theories from is from the Black Power. Now, Black Power is a political slogan and a name which is given to various associated ideologies which aim to achieve self-determination for black people. Now, Black Power, when I clicked on it, I was like, what is this? But then I recognized the fist. So Black Power has caused a lot of problems, especially in the civil rights movement. It has become very radical. And that fist was used, I think, by Black Lives Matter as well. And Black Lives Matter is a horrible group. They destroyed private property, they set stores on fire, and it was horrible, and they gave themselves permission to loot and steal. So they basically became ghetto trash and gave themselves permission to break the law. Now here's the thing, if you really want people to come to your side on things, then you can't be breaking the law. You should be good law-abiding citizens because it's very hard to support your argument if you're being actually very aggressive and tolerant and radical in society and you're breaking the law, hence you're giving the police departments things to do, but then guess what? Black Lives Matter, they have been trying and have been successful at shutting down different police departments. Why? So they don't get arrested. Well, gee, if that's not changing, quote unquote, the status quo in our legal laws, I don't know what is. So you can't blame white people for trying to change the laws when black people have been doing this for a long time. So you can't really cry wolf on this when your own people are doing the very thing that you say is wrong. So you kind of have to, call a kettle black, so to speak. Because here's the thing, the laws of the land apply to everybody equally. Otherwise, you don't have laws. And if you have noticed or you have come across a law that is biased, then you bring it to the attention of lawmakers. It may just be how the law is being interpreted in the court, which affects it might depend on how the jury is interpreting things. It might be a problem with the judge. I'm not saying all judges are bad, but not all of them are good. Why? Because people are flawed. So, I mean, if there's an issue, you handled it appropriately. Like, no one has the excuse to be radical and to break the law. And no one has permission to endanger someone else's life. Well, guess what? Black Lives Matter very much endangered a lot of people's lives, and they didn't care. Also, what's come out against Black Lives Matter, their organization, it's kind of semi-money laundering and fraud. So all this money that people were giving to Black Lives Matter, it actually wasn't going towards what it was supposed to. The people that founded Black Lives Matter and the people that were running that organization, they became millionaires because they did not utilize the money appropriately. What a shock. There's fraud. So the next group is the Chicano or Chicano. And it says here that is a chosen identity for many Mexican Americans in the United States. So I guess it's a term that Mexican Americans came up with so that they could keep their identity, which I find very odd, because the thing is that I guess during the 60s and 70s, a lot of people immigrated to the United States from Central America and from South America. So they have a lot of Hispanic culture, right? Well, a lot of them immigrated here to the United States, and some of them refused to assimilate to, I guess, the American way and the American society because they didn't want to be white, I guess is what it is. They didn't want to have to practice whiteness, is what they called it. But see, here's the thing. When you immigrate somewhere, you do assimilate so that you fit in, so that you can get a job, buy a house, have a bank account, become a citizen, do all these things that are normal. But if you're not assimilating, then you're not going to understand, first of all, the language of the land, and you're going to have a very hard time finding a job. You know, just because you assimilate somewhere doesn't mean you lose your heritage. So, you know, these again are whiners and complainers, and this occurred in the 60s and 70s, and they came up with their own term, the Chicano or Chicano, however you want to pronounce it. And it's one of those things that, you know, let me put it this way. Let's say I moved to Mexico. And let's say I didn't care to learn the language of the land. I didn't care to be a part of society. I just wanted to do everything my way. And it better be my way or I'm going to throw a fit. Now, does that make sense? No. In order to be successful wherever you move, you need to learn the lay of the land, you need to learn the language of the land, and you need to be involved in your community. That doesn't mean by assimilating that you lose who you are as a person. It just means that, hey, you're just trying to be a part of society. It doesn't mean you're selling your soul. It just means you're living your life. Unfortunately, with these radical groups, they make it seem like if you try and assimilate to the American lifestyle, then you're turning your back on your people when you are not. And what's interesting, these people that immigrate here to the United States, they say they don't want to assimilate to whiteness or whatever, or to the American life, but yet they want the car, they want the house, they want the high-paying job. It's like, well, that's part of American society, so you either assimilate or you don't. See, because here's the thing, a lot of these people are immigrating here from very dangerous parts of the world, meaning they are leaving very dangerous areas. You know, they have guerrilla warfare, they have little wars and things like that. And I say little wars not to signify that it's a nothing, because war is war, it's actually very serious. But, you know, the kind of wars they have in Central and South America are very graphic and very horrible. And, you know, it's just that we don't hear about all of it because we don't have that kind of lifestyle here. You know, we have a good lifestyle because we create a way of life that anyone could immigrate here and assimilate and have a good life. But if you don't assimilate and you just are trying to be radical, then guess what? You're going to destroy the very thing that you desired, which was freedom. And it says here, the other thinkers that they consider important are radical feminist movements from the 60s and 70s. Now, I would venture to say the feminists of the 60s and 70s are not as radical as the feminists today, because there are some crazy nutbag feminists these days, and I think they make women look bad. I really do. And it really disappoints me because, you know, what I don't understand about women is that sometimes we turn on each other, and we shouldn't do that. Men don't turn on each other like women do. Women fight like cats. It's horrible. Hence, I did not enjoy being in a sorority, and I quit after a year and a half because I was like, this is ridiculous. I'm wasting my brain space, and this is a really stressful way of life, and I don't care for it. But anyway, moving on, it says, academic critics of critical race theory argue it is based on storytelling instead of evidence and reason. I could see how that would be relevant. Rejects truth and merit. I agree with that, and opposes liberalism. Since 2020, conservative U.S. lawmakers have sought to ban or restrict the instruction of CRT along with other anti-racism education in primary and secondary schools, as well as relevant training inside federal agencies. I agree with them on this because our children do not deserve to be brainwashed. Like, I don't even want to read this stuff. Like, I don't want to be indoctrinated in it. So why would I want children to be around this? Like, it just doesn't make sense. It's really weird because, as I've said in times past, children don't need help being bullies. They need help being kind. I don't know if you've ever read Lord of the Flies, but you might want to take a gander at it because critical race theory, it would probably be very much for Lord of the Flies. Goes on to say, advocates of such bans argue that CRT is false. I agree. Anti-American. That's true. Villainizes white people. That's true. Promotes radical leftism. That's true. And indoctrinates children. Wow, that sentence hit the nail on the head. I agree with all of that because it's shocking. It says, advocates of such bans have been accused of misrepresenting the tenets of the importance of CRT and having the goal of broadly silencing discussions of racism, equality, social justice, and the history of race. Wow. Here's the thing. Advocates of these bans are not doing any of that. Here's the thing. I don't think they care if critical race theory is taught in college because those are college kids. You know, those are people that are age 18 and older, typically, unless it's like some genius which already thinks they're an elitist, you know, by the time they're 14 or 13. Anyway, you know, critical race theory can be taught, just not to children. It's not appropriate because children do not have, I would say, little kids and children do not have the same decision-making skills as adults, and they don't understand theory yet. They do not. That's why a lot of, I would say, scientific theories are not taught to children, and it's, you know, they put that off until college because it's very hard for them to grasp it. And it's nothing against kids. It's just that, you know, the human brain, we've talked about this in times past, the human brain is not fully developed, at least the frontal lobe, until age 25. So if the human brain is not fully developed until the age 25, why are we trying to indoctrinate little kids with this kind of theory that is very negative towards the human race? And here's the thing, critical race theory, it does not discuss racism in a very logical way. It just blames whites for things. Well, that's racism. Critical race theory does not promote equality. It promotes inequality because it's raising up pretty much any other race but against white people. Okay, that's inequality, and that goes against civil rights laws and civil rights advocacy. Critical race theory does not promote justice. It promotes social justice, and social justice is one of those stupid terms that the liberal left has been using to try and indoctrinate our children, our society, our courtrooms, and things like that, and that's not appropriate. Critical race theory also does not want people to know, especially our kids, about the history of the human race. Critical race theory scholars, they don't want kids to know that, hey, actually African Americans had their own slaves as well. And so did Native Americans. Like, Native Americans had slaves here in the United States. So whenever slavery was abolished in 1865, needless to say, Native Americans were really pissed off about that. Because they had slaves. They had slaves that were other tribes, other Native Americans, and also blacks. But people typically don't know that. They don't know their history. Well, see, here's the thing. If you don't know history, then you don't know the truth. In critical race theory, it only wants to look at race from, I guess, a people of color point of view. Which makes no sense because then you are completely isolating anybody that is outside people of color. Which would include anyone that's white. So that would include the Irish, the Scottish, French, British, South Africans, white South Africans. I mean, anyone that's white would be excluded. Well, if someone's excluded, then they don't have a voice, right? But yet critical race theory claims that it's for freedom, it's for equality, it's for freedom of speech. It is not. It is not, because it is destroying, I would say, just the normal way of looking at people. And there's, with the liberal left and these progressives, it's very obvious that they want to control how other people think and behave. And, that's not democracy, that's not capitalism, and that's not freedom. Another disturbing thing about critical race theory is they proactively try to change our laws. Well, changing the status quo to fit your agenda is not freedom. That's tyranny. And the reason why it's tyranny is because it's very much Marxist. Marxism is not the American way. It is not. Because if you have Marxism, we would not have democracy, we would not have capitalism, we would not have freedom, and we would be inching towards communism under Marxism. And under communism, when you have that type of government gives itself permission to lock up anyone and everyone that disagrees with them. Well, look at what's happening right now in our culture in the United States, where if someone's offended, they think, oh, well, you're wrong because you hurt my feelings. That's not logical. I mean, even Spock from Star Trek knows that. Could these people at least be logical? Instead of being logical, they're being emotional, and they're not being... How do I describe this? Because they're being emotional, they're not being logical, they're not practicing common sense, and they're not really obeying the laws of the land that are actually there to protect them. But because they think that their agenda and their concept of the human race is more important than actually doing what's right, they are actually willing to change our laws at every level in order to change the status quo. So basically, they are okay with violating someone else's rights because they think they should be suppressed and oppressed. Well, that's not the American way, because that's not equality. That's not democracy. That's not freedom. So maybe they should read two different documents. First of all, the Bible. Number two, the Constitution of the United States. And I say the Bible first because the Bible teaches us about how to be good and kind to other people. I mean, maybe they should read the book of Proverbs, and also read the book of Psalms. Proverbs and wisdom gives excellent advice to people. I think everyone should read those. Even if they're not Christian, I think they should read them. Because they're very insightful. It's really good. The book of Psalms, I think, is good because it's calming. It's very calming whenever you know God's love for you, because I think there are so many of these elitists, they throw religion out the window and then they embrace hate. They throw God's love out the window and then embrace whatever ideology comes into their brain, and they claim that it's the right way. But yet it violates a lot of human rights. Especially in regards to civil rights. It's like, technically civil rights have not been around on this planet very long, so shouldn't we do everything that we can to preserve them and to enforce them? I think that's very important because, I know that whenever my rights are violated, someone else's rights are violated. Because we are a community of people. We are a nation of citizens. So when one suffers, we all suffer. That's how freedom works. Also, that's how community works. And I'm not trying to sound like a socialist, not by any means, but it's one of those things that, hey, let's say, for example, I go to church, and I find out that someone at my church is going through a really tough situation. I would feel their pain. Why? Because I know them and I feel for them, and I would offer my help to them. Hey, do you need me to pray for anything? What do you need help with? Why? Because I know them and I love them, and their pain is my pain. See, that's the Christian way of living, but if you take the socialist point of view, then it's government that claims to help with everything. And it doesn't. Government causes a lot of problems, unfortunately. And then what's even made worse is when you get bad people in positions of power, especially in these federal agencies and also state agencies, but you get these elitists in roles of power within these state agencies, and then they remain in power for a long time. That's where it gets to be a problem. An example of that is J. Edgar Hoover. He was in charge of the FBI for way too long. He did a lot of good, but there was no turnover. There was not turnover. There was no transition of power. Can you imagine having the same boss for like 30, 40, 50 years? And what if they're a jerk? I mean, if they're nice, that's great. But even then, it's nice to get some new blood in there, because if you never get new blood in there, then you never really address any new issues. You never think outside the box. And normally I don't like that phrase, but in this case I think it's very relevant. But it's the same thing. We have to be very careful about who is put into these roles within the federal agencies, because whenever you have a Democrat in office, and right now we have progressives in office, so they're putting people into positions of power within these federal agencies, and who knows what kind of havoc they're creating. That's why it's very important to recognize that just because someone has a theory, that doesn't mean they're right. Because again, a theory is just a theory. It's not proven. Because, when a theory gets proven, then it becomes fact. It's no longer a theory, it's actual black and white yes and no. That's why critical race theory should not be taught to children, because they do not understand the difference between theory and black and white yes and no, this is factual. It's almost like the difference between evidence and circumstantial evidence. Circumstantial evidence is not black and white yes and no, so to me personally should not be admissible in any court of law. I mean, someone can look incredibly guilty, but if you don't have actual factual evidence, then you should not and cannot try them. You cannot take them to court. At least you should not. What's interesting is that circumstantial evidence, this is just a tidbit, circumstantial evidence used to not be allowed in courts, at least in the United States. But then it was allowed many years back, and then that's when more and more people were locked up falsely and were falsely imprisoned. And then the real perpetrator got off scot-free. So needless to say, it's important that we have the facts and that we not base things just on a theory. Well, this is what we feel. This is what we think. No, it needs to be what you know. Like, for example, I know that I'm not just a white person, I'm a mix of several races. So whenever someone is making a racist statement against whites, I'm like, well, which part of Europe are you referring to this day? Which segment of the population are you harassing in your statement there? I mean, it's just like, give me a break. You know what I mean? Like, if racism is not appropriate to be perpetrated against blacks, then it's not okay to have racism against whites. Because when you remove the emotion and the political agenda, I think people are more easily able to recognize that, hey, racism should not be tolerated in any shape or form. I mean, if anything, I think these critical race scholars should pretend that they're HR managers and realize that they shouldn't be thinking or acting that way or speaking that way towards any kind of race, because it looks really bad. And it's not appropriate, and technically it's not legal. Because it's like I said, if that one chick, that Mari chick or whatever, if she owned a company she would probably be sued in federal court for being a racist. And any number of those scholars would probably be sued if they worked in the private sector. That's why a lot of these professors work at universities, usually liberal universities, because they can't function in normal society. They're too weird. And they're usually atheist or agnostic. They're very rarely Christian. And if they are Christian, they don't act Christian. And what I've noticed is that when they claim to be Christian, they typically go to some really hateful churches that are anti-white. How is that any different than the Ku Klux Klan? I mean, really. If it was wrong for those guys to do that way back in the 30s or whatever, then why is it okay for critical race theory to be taught to our kids? Because it's teaching them that, well, it's okay to target white people, but anybody else, you can't target them. But white people, they're fair game. Just take all the problems of the planet and dump it on a white person's front yard, and then blame them for everything and say, all this is your fault, even though you don't know what we're talking about, it's all your fault, so we're blaming you. Here's the thing, white people have become the scapegoat for pretty much anybody else's misery. And it's pathetic. It's like, can't you take responsibility for your own issues and your own problems? Do you really have to make other people's lives miserable? It makes no sense to me. And I think it's very much one of those things where, whenever people don't take responsibility for their own actions, guess what? They never become a better version of themselves because they never acknowledge, the behavior problems. They never acknowledge the things that they did that was wrong. Well, I think we know from repeat offenders in terms of the criminal justice system that whenever someone is a repeat offender, guess what? They're just choosing not to take responsibility for their actions. Even though they get caught, they're not taking responsibility for it because they are continuing to live in that lifestyle. Do we really want that same mindset to take place just in everyday life? I don't think so. I think that totally ruins society. And it does not unify the United States, it divides us. So critical race theory to me completely and utterly divides the United States. And here's the thing, that's the plan. That's the plan and the purpose of critical race theory, because you have to remember that whenever anything is founded in Marxism or communism, it is always to destroy the United States and to destroy any type of freedom, any type of democracy, and it also wants to destroy capitalism. Why? Because it wants the money. But it doesn't want other people to have money, they want the money. You'd be surprised how many Marxists and communists have problems with greed, almost every single one of them. Why else in these communist countries would the Communist Party, the first thing they take over is the banking system? It's not always the government, it's almost always the banking system. And typically those things go hand in hand. So I wish more people were aware that Marxists and anarchists, they do not have your best intention in mind. They're not there to help you or to protect you. They want what you have, which is a form of greed. I guess they kind of put some sugar on it and make it seem like, oh, well, we're talking about racism and we're going to call it critical race theory and we're going to change the world, make it a better place. You know what? It's very similar to the Environmental Protection Agency right now, the EPA, where, especially this was during Barack Obama's term as well, the EPA did everything it could to confiscate people's private property, claiming that the federal government needed it. Wow, the federal government practicing thievery. What a surprise whenever there's a Democrat in office. So, I mean, it's just kind of those things. The apple doesn't fall far from the tree. And there's a reason for that. Because whenever you have a dangerous doctrine like critical race theory, it's not surprising when very negative things come out of it or are the side effect of it. Because it's not helping society, it's trying to tear it apart. And all for the sake of money and control. So, FYI, be aware of that. But I will go ahead and end this podcast. But as usual, until next time, I pray that you're happy, healthy, and whole, that you have a wonderful day and a wonderful week. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.